Hello, everyone. Welcome. Hi. My name is Sarah Hallenbeck, and I'm the co-owner of Women and Children First. We're one of the last remaining feminist bookstores in the United States. We're so excited for tonight's event with Adam Goodman and Antonio Gutierrez in honor of Adam's new book, The Deportation Machine, America's Long History of Expelling Immigrants. But first, we begin our virtual events as we begin our events in the store with a land acknowledgement. So please join me in taking a moment to acknowledge that the land on which this bookstore sits is the occupied unceded territory of the Peoria, the Potawatomi, the Miami, and the Sioux people. We encourage all of you to learn more about land acknowledgements and the rightful owners of the land where you are viewing tonight's event by visiting nativeland.ca. Thank you so much. Our physical bookstore has actually been closed for more than 2 months due to COVID-19. But throughout this pandemic, we've continued to gather virtually via Crowdcast. We hope you're able to join us back here on this platform on Friday, July 17th at 6 p.m. when we'll welcome Ilana Masad and Michael Zapata for their new novels. And a few housekeeping notes before we get started. There is a button at the bottom of your screen where you can buy the book for tonight's event, The Deportation Machine. We do have signed copies, so just click that button if you would like to purchase one. I also encourage all of you to ask questions by using the Ask a Question button that's also located at the bottom of your screen. Now on to tonight's event. Adam Goodman teaches in the Department of History and the Latin American and Latino Studies program at the University of Illinois at Chicago. His writing has appeared in such outlets as the Washington Post, The Nation, and the Journal of American History. Goodman is a faculty advisor to UIC's Fearless Undocumented Alliance, a co-convener of the Newberry Library's The Borderlands and Latinx Studies seminar, and a co-organizer of the #Immigration Syllabus Public History Project. This is his first book. Antonio Gutierrez recently joined Organized Communities Against Deportation, also known as OCAD, full-time as a Strategic Development and Operations Coordinator. Gutierrez is one of the co-founders of the Albany Park Defense Network and the Autonomous Tenants Union, which is a housing collective that does anti-gentrification work in the city of Chicago. In The Deportation Machine, Adam Goodman exposes the pervasive roots of anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States. This book is immediately engaging from the very first sentence and also infuriating and enraging. Goodman chronicles how our so-called nation of immigrants has been pushing for and profiting from the expulsion of immigrants since our country's beginning, and how today's racist policies are unfortunately nothing new. I'm so excited for this conversation. Please welcome Adam Goodman and Antonio Gutierrez.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Good evening. My name is Antonio Gutierrez. I use they, them, their pronouns, and I'm the strategic coordinator for Organized Communities Against Deportations, and also a co-founder of the organization. Today, during our programming, we'll be doing a short reading of Adam's book. We'll also be having a conversation about the book and what I learned from reading the book itself. We'll talk about OCAD's current work and its resemblance to the book of the history of resistance towards the deportation machine throughout history in the United States. And then we'll have time for question and answer. So please ask your question, write it down, as Sarah kind of instructed us, which is located in the bottom of your screen. But with that, we'll start with reading a short passage from the book itself. Adam?
Thanks, Antonio. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be in conversation with you. I'm looking forward to this very much. This was going to be the in-person book launch for the event back in May. We needed to change plans because of COVID-19, and I'm very happy that it worked out to do this virtually, and I appreciate everyone joining us. OCAD is an organization I learned about as soon as I moved to Chicago, and I've really admired the work that you and your colleagues are doing there and people in the community are doing on behalf of immigrants. And Women and Children First is also a really crucial institution in the city, and unapologetically political, which I really appreciate. And I was thinking that this would be the perfect way to launch the book, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation and the question and answer afterwards. And I hope that everyone will do a couple things as well, if you're so inclined, both supporting Women and Children First by buying the book and buying many other books, and supporting OCAD by donating to the organization. I think a little later on, Sarah is going to provide a link so you can do that. And if you need any extra incentive, I want to commit tonight for every copy of the book that people purchase through Women and Children First, I'd like to donate $20 to OCAD if we needed extra incentive to support these two wonderful organizations. So I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. And I think it's also appropriate in that the origins of the book really come out of the inspiration I got from the early 2010s when OCAD's predecessor, IJL, the Immigrant Youth Justice League, and other young people around the country were coming out as undocumented and unafraid and unapologetic, and participating in acts of civil disobedience, strategizing ways to try to contest deportation and fight against the machine. And I was in Philadelphia at that time, and witnessed many of those very powerful political acts. And I became interested in learning more about the history of how people had resisted the machine, as well as just how the machine worked. Because I think one of the things I learned from doing this research in the past decade was that in order to fight the machine, you need to understand how it works. So I wanted to start tonight just by reading a few paragraphs from the beginning of the 5th chapter, which is Fighting the Machine in the Streets and in the Courts. And this is from an earlier era, but I think a lot of it will resonate and ring true. So we'll just go from there. Javier Garcia Bautista had not been working for long on Wednesday, May 17th, 1978, when someone in the carpentry department of the Sabika of California Inc. shoe company in suburban South El Monte yelled out, "The migra is here." Early that morning, after a planning meeting in their downtown Los Angeles office, 40 INS, Immigration and Naturalization Service, 40 INS investigators piled into at least 8 vans and 1 bus and headed east to their target. They arrived a little before 8 a.m., and after a company executive gave them permission to conduct a quote-unquote survey, the agents blocked off all the exits, the front door leading out to the employee parking lot, the north-facing windows, and the loading dock near the gate around back. With the building secured, teams of 3 to 4 investigators entered the factory and fanned out. Hoping to avoid detection, the 22-year-old Garcia Bautista tucked himself out of sight. As he hid, the agents circulated throughout the massive 62,500 square foot plant, indiscriminately questioning the workers and asking them if they had papers. They arrested men and women, taking down their information, handcuffing some and pushing others. Soon after the raid started, 2 agents from Supervisor Jail O'Brien's crew approached 17-year-old Rosa Melchor Lopez at her workstation. When she didn't respond to their inquiry about whether she had papers, they took a hold of her arms, one on either side of the 5'2" woman. Once outside the factory, an investigator searched Melchor Lopez's bag and then shoved her onto the INS bus, which was already packed with her coworkers. At 10:05 a.m., as the operation wound down, plainclothes investigator Raleigh Clark shined his flashlight into a large container. "I see a body here," he called out, at which point he and another agent pulled Javier Garcia Bautista from his hiding place, handcuffed him, and led him out to the waiting vehicles. The INS investigators returned to downtown Los Angeles that morning with 119 Sabika employees in custody. By mid-afternoon, they had coerced most of the people to sign voluntary departure forms. Around 5 p.m., no more than 9 hours after the raid had started, half of the workers, some 24 men, and all of the 35 women in the group were aboard government buses headed to San Isidro, where they would be deported to Mexico. But the buses never made it to the border that evening. What neither the immigration officials nor the Sabica employees knew at the time was that as agents loaded the detainees onto the buses, a coalition of immigrants, labor organizers, and lawyer activists had convinced the federal judge to sign a temporary restraining order stopping the workers' deportation. Nor could they have imagined that in the days, weeks, months, and years ahead, the case would provide a blueprint for how to bring the seemingly unstoppable deportation machine to a grinding halt. So I'll leave it at that. But I think that, I wanted to start with that because it does tie into these broader questions about, first and foremost, how the deportation machine works, and that being an essential step to understanding how to contest it and how to fight it. And the rest of that chapter narrates the history of that struggle, in which 60 of the people that ended up fighting their cases had their deportations order stayed. The vast majority of them did, that is. And they also won a class action lawsuit later on that had really important implications for up to 1 million people in the country without documents, and that immigration officers would need to provide them with their basic Miranda rights of the right to remain silent, the right to legal counsel prior to establishing their deportability. Right? That action started, with 119 and then 60, workers at a shoe factory, but it ended up having a much broader, wider impact than that. And that stemmed from their understanding of where the pressure points were within the deportation machine, and then, pressing on them as hard as they could. So, I wanted to ask you, Antonio, as well, if you could share a little bit perhaps about, how you understand this work and the work that OCAD does, OCAD's history as well, about, you're constantly engaging with these types of questions as to what the most effective strategies are. And I think putting into conversation some of the history that I cover in the book and some of the work that you all are doing today, it could be really fruitful and useful.
So as you were kind of explaining, right, a lot of the co-founders of the Organized Communities Against Deportations come from the Immigrant Youth Justice League, AJO, which it was an undocumented led youth collective that was doing civil disobedience and direct action around the necessities that we saw as directly impacted individuals, right? We were the first ones to announce very publicly, right, that we were undocumented, that we were unafraid, and later on unapologetically. And that kind of created a momentum to then identify, right, that for the first time, undocumented immigrants were fighting for their own rights, that nobody was speaking on our behalf, but that we had found the courage to do the civil disobedience of proclaiming publicly our own status or lack of status, as I say. And from there, we started working on the empowerment of undocumented youth at that point. Later on, during the Obama administration, we saw an increase of deportations, right? So I know that many individuals within our society in the United States, they believe that deportations is a new topic based on the rhetoric of Trump that he continuously has used during his election process, and then as now as he's the president. But that is not the case, right? Just as the book explains, this is something that has been going on for centuries. Just the little passage that you just read from your book, right, that from 1978, it just sounds very familiar to many of us that live in constant fear of a raid happening in our workplace, in our homes, and that is carried on by ICE terrorizing our communities. And so when we started seeing this increase of deportations during the Obama administration, we formed OCAD back in 2013. And we shifted our work and our focus to make sure that we were also addressing these deportations. And we did it without really knowing this deportation machine, right? And what it meant to fight it or resist it. It sounds like, and it's great to have this book now as a reference to learn from what other organizations, other movements did prior to us. But back then, we didn't really knew about the history or that research itself, right? Mm-hmm. We had to kind of start from what we thought it was a new adventure that nobody else had taken. And we started by learning the legal process of immigration deportation system. We started by working with attorneys and realizing that many of the times the legal route was not going to get us the win of being able to stay within our communities and to fight or stop a deportation, but that it was going to require organizing strategy and direct action as well. And that the legal process is really there to hopefully find some kind of relief based on the circumstances of each of individual situation or circumstances, but that at the end of the day, it's also there to just kind of delay the process so that the organizing can really get us the win. I come from that type of organizing background, as that was my first experience towards organizing after I graduated from college, and that I found myself with a diploma that was only a piece of paper due to lack of a work permit, right? And so from there, we started doing deportation campaigns, sometimes successful, sometimes not. And every single time learning from that experience about what we needed to do in the next campaign that we were going to be jumping in or wanting to support an individual.
Sorry, I was just going to say, could you describe, maybe just share a little bit about what those campaigns look like? Kind of what were the strategies and the tactics, the things that you and other members of OCAD did to effectively defend people?
Yeah, as we started OCAD, I think one of the main intentions about OCAD's work was to fight this narrative around the good versus bad immigrant and who could be deportable and who needed to be protected. And as OCAD, we were very clear that there is a linkage between how individuals, especially people of color, are criminalized in the United States, and not just undocumented immigrants, right? We see that with the movement of Black Lives Matter. We see that with police brutality. And we see with the exploitation that happens for many of the workers or people of color throughout the capitalist system. And so we were very much aware of that, and we wanted to fight that narrative of certain individuals deserving to be deported. And so the cases that we started bringing up to the attention, or that we wanted to that we selected in order to find our support to those individuals, were individuals that somehow were connected to the immigration system or were detained by ICE due to a criminal offense or a criminal record. And so the first case that we did as OCAD was of a man named Octavio. And Octavio was an undocumented immigrant living in Melrose Park that was literally detained and put in deportation proceedings because of not stopping properly at a stop sign. And then the cop stopping him after he had already stopped his car, questioned him about his documentation, right? And then eventually left him alone, and to only find ICE coming to his home and detaining him only a couple of days after. And so those were the type of cases that we wanted to highlight and that we continue to highlight, where we see this connection between collaboration between law enforcement or local police agencies with ICE, and the referral of undocumented immigrants, right, into the criminal system, and then out of the criminal system into the deportation machine to be deported into the countries of origin. Some of the tactics that we did from the beginning, right, and that we continue to do now are things like core support, to show that that individual is not there alone, not only to comfort that individual itself, is facing deportation is a very scary and stressful situation, as one can imagine, but also to show the judges that there was a community behind that individual.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, some of the actions I've seen you all do, and, I've joined in some of those opportunities to support individuals, some of my students at UIC, who themselves have faced immigration enforcement actions and efforts to deport them. And I know that you've really effectively organized campaigns and made use of the media to support the cases. And I think that's, crucial. And there's so many different ways in which that can be done, but the broad-based support and the solidarity, I think, are really important. And also the fact that you all are beginning from the community, that's where it starts. And then figuring out the strategies that are most effective and getting support, from different arenas is, a nice add-on. But it really starts in the community and the immediate needs of the individuals that you're most engaged in and directly supporting.
Mm-hmm. And I think overall, right, one of our main tactics and strategies has always been to shift the narrative, to humanize the issue, right? When we say there's 25,000 individuals in detention center right now, and we just see that as a number, we need to remember that there's 25,000 human beings that are currently detained for no other reason but lack of legal status to be in this country. And so that's, I think, one of the main core focuses and goals of OCAD throughout the beginning of organization of our work and to our current work now.
No, that's great. And I think it's just helpful to have some of those connections. And, as I think everyone who's watching can probably tell, I mean, tonight's really an opportunity to learn about the book and also just as much to learn about OCAD's work and kind of where those two intersect.
Mm-hmm. So with that, let's start a little bit about some of the things that I found surprising about the book. As I said, I was very surprised to kind of hear from kind of this resistance history that started all the way back from the 70s of the 1900s. And then to see that a lot of the tactics and strategies, like combining legal and organizing strategies, was something that had already been done, right? And so I also found the other thing very surprising is that this relationship between criminalization and immigration has been was done based on an Immigration Act back 1929, right? And so it's been a long history that immigration has been also been pursued as a criminal act. Mm-hmm. And that is something that is OCAD, as I was explaining, we always kind of have made that connection or that connection to the way that undocumented immigrants end up in the deportation machine. But Adam, the question that I have for you, right, is when you were doing this research and you were finding all these different chronological history moments that get us to the deportation machine of the current state currently, what were the things that surprised you when you were doing that research?
There are many things along the way. First and foremost, another realization that I think led me to write this book was the fact that the United States has deported 57 million people since the late 19th century. Right? Many of those, obviously, in the post-World War II period, but even dating back to the late 19th century, where the book starts, and moving forward in time. And in fact, in the last 100 years, the country has deported more people than it's allowed to stay on a permanent basis. And that was a really shocking revelation. And it led me to the question that begins the book. And that's, what kind of nation is the United States? Right? We hear so often about the mythical nation of immigrants narrative. I think many people are aware that that's a problematic narrative. It doesn't ring true. It doesn't hold up to scrutiny. But there's a dual kind of narrative and attention at play here throughout U.S. history. The United States is both a nation of immigrants in the sense that it's had more people come to the country than most other, if not all other places, but it's also deported more people than all other countries. And those two things are in tension. And I wanted to explore that history. And I think when we look closely at the ways in which restriction, exclusion, detention, and deportation have played an important role in the United States, we see that throughout U.S. history, that has been a defining feature. And we see that there have been tens of millions of people stripped away from their communities, their families, their jobs. And I don't think that's something that many people are fully aware of. And also thinking about the cumulative impact of that over time, thinking about the immigrant experience, if we can even call something that. I think it's not necessarily helpful to think of a prototypical immigrant experience because there's so many diverse experiences, so many peoples, different times, different places, different circumstances. But if we do want to generalize for a moment, I think that we need to reckon with the fact that U.S. policies have been incredibly punitive and traumatic for so many non-citizens and people that have come to this country. And circling back to the point you bring up, the very important point that it's not just this false divide between us and them. We cannot think of good immigrants, bad immigrants. We cannot think of U.S. citizens and non-citizens. There's so many families, couples, parents and children, brothers and sisters who live in mixed status families, or perhaps your best friend or your partner, whoever it might be. I think that that's something we hear a lot coming out of Washington and from politicians, but it's not anything that holds up to scrutiny. And if we think of, not us and them, and not these two distinct groups, but instead, right, of one people in this country that live here, work here, create lives here, then it becomes much more difficult to justify so many of those punitive actions. I think part of that narrative that you mentioned, the criminalization of migrants, right, which dates back a century as well, if not further, that in turn justifies inhumane treatment of people, right? And that's a first step. Attacking the criminalization of migrants and dispelling that myth would be a first step, I think, to perhaps changing some of those policies. And those are, some of the things that really stood out to me as I was moving through the process of researching and writing the book. But there's a lot more that I could share, and hopefully we can get into a little bit. But I did want to circle back and ask a little bit about the work that you all have done in OCAD around the campaign Protection for All. And I think before that, I would just say that a lot of times people think of if there's been any progress in immigration, even kind of incremental progress. Sometimes people think of the DACA program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which allows people who are brought here to the United States to remain in the country without fear of deportation to an extent, although we've seen, unfortunately, that's not entirely true either, but to work, to go to school, to drive. I mean, it's had a tremendous impact on people's lives. And sometimes you hear mainstream media describe it as the Obama administration just, created DACA benevolently. And I just want to point out before turning it over to you that this only happened because of on-the-ground organizing and sustained pressure over so many years that pushed the Obama administration to act. The program isn't perfect. It obviously doesn't get all the way to where I think OCAD is pushing and where most organizations are, but it was a really crucial victory that only happened because of that pressure and resulted in the protection of hundreds of thousands of people from deportation. But now, and even in the past, you all have been pushing much beyond DACA in efforts like Protection for All. So maybe you could speak a little bit about those campaigns and the efforts that you're involved in.
Yes, sure. So OCAD is an undocumented-led organization, right? And I think that that's a really important distinction between other immigrant rights organizations. We understand not only our story of what brought us here to the United States from our own countries of origin and what that travel, what that situation was, right? What forced us to be here. And that also determines us, right? That just as we have that story or that reason why we came to the United States, that any immigrant that is in the United States is also in that same situation, right? They had that reason, whether it's to escape violence, or whether it was better opportunities, or whether it was because there were other reasonings behind, wanting to reunite with family members that were here, right? And so that's going to be something that we keep in mind through how we direct our work. Some of the work that we have done throughout the years, right, is, as I said, kind of direct this aspect of criminalization and deportation, and making sure that anything that ICE or the presidential administration was claiming or keeps claiming, that we also are highlighting how they're not following their own procedures or what they're communicating to the public, right? All the way from the rhetoric or kind of the narrative that both Obama and Trump uses, right? That only criminals are getting deported, and that is the people that you don't want in your communities. When in reality, we know that when people come to the United States, right, they come for a better life, and they come and whether the immigration or the system likes it or not, they build roots into their communities. They become part of their communities. And just the act of the violent force to displace them or to take them away from our communities is kind of what we're fighting for. Some of the other campaigns that we've done, one that comes in mind right now is Wilmer Catalan. So Wilmer is a Chicago resident from the back of the yards neighborhood who was placed in the Chicago Police Department gang database. And this gang database gets shared with agencies like immigration. ICE then used this information to go and detain without a warrant Wilmer and put him in detention for over 10 months while we fought his deportation. Within that process, right, OCAD also did our first time using litigation as a legal tactic or strategy to delay the process of deportation and to eventually get the leverage enough to get his release. And so when we think about OCAD's work, it's really important that we're always going to be highlighting this aspect of criminalization. And I see that there's already some questions, right, on the chat box that we'll get to those at the end of the conversation for sure. But I continue to voice and want you all to reflect upon this need of deportations and whether there is such a need for anybody overall. And that I think as OCAD, we see the humanity of all of those that we share the status of being undocumented in the United States, and that we understand that many of the things that forced us to come to the United States were actually policies and things that the United States did to many of our countries of origin by exploiting our labor, our natural resources, and leaving our countries in poverty that forced many of us to force migrate into where the resources were, finding them here in the United States. And so we cannot forget that just as the history of the internal immigration system exists within the United States and that your book really describes, there's also a history broader than that globally of the terrorization and violence that the United States has done to many countries many of the countries that people from that are undocumented share or they come from.
Yeah, could I just jump in for 1 second on that point? I think, what I show in the book is that the deportation machine has functioned for many different reasons, but a few of the biggest impacts it's had, right, is creating and maintaining an exploitable labor force. The United States has always depended on immigrant labor, and the more control employers have had over those workers, the better from the perspective of the employers, and the government has facilitated that. And hanging the threat of deportation over someone's head, is a way to control that source of labor. And that's one important thing. Another thing is that the deportation machine has served the interests of the federal immigration bureaucracy throughout its history, right, which has a vested interest in expanding its power, expanding its control, increasing its congressional budget, right? And one way to do that is by celebrating, from their perspective, their accomplishments, is what they would call them, right? Apprehensions, detentions, deportations. And the machine fuels that as well. And the third thing it really does is that it creates very clear ideas, and I think really problematic ideas about, who is an American, and it fuels xenophobia. At different times throughout the last 140, 150 years, the machine has demonized and criminalized everyone from Chinese immigrants, Japanese immigrants, Mexicans, certainly consistently throughout the 20th century, more recently Central Americans, Arabs, Muslims, South Asians. And this was a real eye-opener for me as well. When I dug a little bit deeper into the statistics, I found that 90% of deportations throughout U.S. history have been of Mexicans, right? A disproportionate targeting, to say the least, compared to the percentage of the population the Mexicans make up in the United States, or the immigrant population of the overall population. And that's had a real negative impact and effect on popular ideas that are then pushed through the media, about Mexicans being the prototypical illegal immigrant, is the way that the federal government, I think, puts it, and the media then propagates that idea moving forward. right? But in part because of that need for exploitable labor and because of the disproportionate targeting. So it's not just that the immigration officials are targeting Mexicans disproportionately because they're racist, even though that plays an important role in many cases. It's also that the targeting of immigrants itself is playing a role in creating anti-Mexican racism, if that makes sense. You know, that's something that I think we can see throughout the history of the 20th century. But you know, there's a lot of losers, many more losers, in fact, than there are winners that profit from the deportation machine. I think that's what Antonio was also, you know, getting at with some of their comments earlier. But Antonio, do you want to take it? I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to say on that point, or if there was another direction you wanted to go in.
Kind of going back to that, right? What do you think that are the role of these profit motives that played within immigration policy based on what you wrote in the book? Are we interested in kind of hearing that?
Sure. You know, this was another eye-opening discovery and revelation that, you know, I really throughout the book try to focus in not just on how the machine works and how the political and institutional history of deportation has changed, but on what the human costs are. And I wanted to try to get at, from a historical perspective, what have been the human costs of punitive immigration enforcement policies? And they've been extraordinary, you know, perhaps unsurprisingly, but you know, it's incredibly disturbing. Many of the instances that I came across in the archives that I'm able to document and show. And the human costs were high for many reasons, but two of the main ones were that immigration policy has oftentimes been driven by profit motive and by punishment. Right? The very policies and the implementation of immigration policies have been punitive by design. They're punitive in nature in hopes of getting people to not return to the United States. Right? So in the third chapter of my book, which looks at the business of deportation throughout the 20th century, zooms in, especially in the 1950s, on an operation that deported nearly 50,000 people across the Gulf of Mexico on ships, on transportation cargo ships, where deportees were placed in the same holds that private Mexican companies used to transport bananas from Tabasco to the United States and then returned south with deportees just to take advantage of that return trip and make an extra buck. And you know, that, as you might imagine, created horrible conditions on board those ships. And the immigration officials were very happy with that because they saw the deportation on these boats as a way to discourage future migration. And the commissioner of immigration at that time was a man named Joseph M. Swing, who was a former general in the Army. He was appointed by President Dwight Eisenhower in 1954. And what he said about these trips was that, you know, he said, and I'm quoting him here, he said, the Mexicans hate the boat lift like the devil hates holy water. Right? I mean, if there was any question about what the intention was of the operation, I mean, that quote kind of lays bare the fact that immigration officials wanted this act of physically removing someone from the country to be punitive. They wanted it to stop people from returning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, you know, the second piece, the profit motives, is one that has become increasingly important over time. And we see that today there are big companies like the Geo Group or Corrections Corporation America, which is now known as Core Civic. And they are instrumental in lobbying in Washington and also pushing for more punitive policies, to the tremendous cost and detriment of people that find themselves trapped within the machine.
Mm-hmm.
So does that get at your question?
No, it definitely does, right? As OCAD, we've been highlighting the amount of profit that these private detention centers make out of keeping undocumented immigrant bodies in cages, right? There is an industry, a business to be made in the deportation machine by profiting out of keeping bodies, like brown bodies, in cages. And that is something that we have continued to highlight, that we currently are highlighting during COVID-19 through the Free Them All campaign, right? Which
That's
is
right.
clarifying and uplifting the conditions that exist in detention centers even prior to COVID-19, right? The case of Wilmer highlighted that for us when he needed medical attention, and he will constantly was either dismissed or was given just aspirin for pain of like recovering pain that he needed like real medical attention. And that even with the litigation that we file against the detention center because of those conditions, right, that goes without saying that ICE is not disclosing how individuals are taken into these detention centers, how they have a quota system with many of these private like detention centers, right, through their agreements around how many individuals need to be placed in beds every day through the United States, right? And how the quota gets met by terrorizing, by doing raids in our communities, and by really just detaining individuals just so that the detention centers can still make profit out of individuals that are detained in there, right? So without even a probable cause or a reasoning why to detain or deport that individual, they're placed there just based on the agreements that they have with these detention centers.
Right.
And right now with Free Them All, or with the conditions with COVID-19, it is very alarming what is happening inside detention centers. And it's very alarming the little information that ICE actually gives up, right? And which ultimately is also very deceiving. In that we see that ICE, whether it was ICE or back then INS, they have always kind of deceived the public by not showing up everything that they know that is happening internally. And that is something that we're trying to highlight by hoping that the mass release of all the individuals that are in detention right now, which, as I said, is over 25,000 individuals. And before COVID started, it was over 33,000.
That's right.
So yes.
I would just, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, a lot of this is making me think of another point that I think is important for people to understand, and that's that, xenophobic or racist politicians play a big part in driving the deportation machine, but there are many other parties involved and many other parties and people who benefit and profit from it. So it's not as simple as voting someone out of office, although I think that is an important thing as well, without a doubt. But there's many other vested interests who are involved and would like to see things, more or less stay the same and wouldn't like to see major changes. So that's something for people to keep in mind. It's something that certainly OCAD has been working with and targeting throughout their work over the last many years.
With that, Adam, do you want to maybe, since it's 7:50, right? So I'm going to do a little time check. So an organizer, do you want to take on some of these like questions that people have been posting on the chat box? And then we might keep the question that we had in mind to end the event.
Sure.
Maybe after that.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, if people have questions.
Sounds good. And I'll read based on what I see. I have one here. As we fight for a more humane immigration policy, what are the types, if any, of deportations that should be allowed to proceed? I ask because policy change will likely be the result of political compromise, and we won't be able to stop all deportations. What types should be allowed to proceed, if any? So I don't know if you want to take that first, and then I can answer.
Yeah, I would definitely love to hear what your thoughts are. I think that there's a couple different responses that I would give to this question. Right? One is that first and foremost, things have never worked as they are. The current system does not work. I mean, some people say it works as designed, and that is to be punitive, that is to generate profits. But at the same time, if we look at it from the perspective of migrants, and I think from a humane perspective, we clearly see that things do not work and need to be changed. So part of it is how we're seeing this and shifting the perspective, not from one strictly of national security or the nation state, but to the people who live here and the many people that they're connected to and that they care about. And the immigration service itself has always had a dual identity. as both an enforcement agency and a service agency. And I think within the existing structures, if we're to say that there will not be revolutionary change and the immigration enforcement bureaucracy will still continue, if we shifted more energy and resources towards service and toward providing needed services for the migrant community, that would be, I think, a good use of resources and a good way to divert some of the most punitive policies and make immigration more humane and make, I think, lives of everyone in this country better as a result. It's another thing to remember. These are taxpayer dollars that are funding these horrible policies, which I think most people would find real problems with and take issue with. Anywhere you're drawing a line is going to create divisions and problems. And I think that there's different arguments people can make about where that line should be drawn. But as Antonio mentioned earlier, someone may have committed a crime. It might be a minor infraction. In fact, most are. Most of the hardened criminals that the government talks about targeting are people that have either administrative offenses, immigration offenses, or perhaps traffic violations, minor drug offenses. Those make up the vast majority of all the people targeted for apprehension and deportation. So there might be a piecemeal way to go about that, but I think there's also much broader, more idealistic solutions. And Antonio, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Antonio?
Are we back on?
I think I'm back. Can you hear me and see me?
I can see you now. And I also had a moment too. I don't know if it was just the program. Thank you, everybody. We were
I apologize.
This happens with virtual events as we're doing them now. So thank you, everybody, for your patience around that. Adam, you were in the middle of answering that question. I don't know if you want to go back to that, or if not, I can elaborate on my own response.
So I don't know where I got cut off. I had 5 minutes of just pure brilliance that solved all the world's problems. So I don't know if I can pull that off again, but yeah, I'm not sure exactly where I got cut off, but I would say that there's many different things that could happen, both just very briefly. Within the current system, if we shift more resources towards service for the migrant community as opposed to enforcement, those are the dual roles the immigration bureaucracy always has played. And right now it leans much more heavily toward enforcement as opposed to service. So if we do that, that would be one thing. And also most of the people who are targeted for deportation, they are not criminals, as I think most people would understand what it means to be a criminal. They're not hardened criminals at all. And they're people that have immigration infractions. They're people with minor traffic violations or drug offenses. And I think there's also an argument to be made, as Antonio did earlier, about the fact that even people who do have criminal offenses, they're still members of our community. They're still parts of our family. parts of our workplaces, our college classes. And I think that, wherever we draw the line, it's going to be problematic. But different people might have different opinions about where that line should be drawn or whether there should be a line at all. So I don't know, Antonio, if you have any thoughts or ideas about that, or whether we should move on.
Yeah, I'll keep it very short. I think that, as I was sharing, right, from my perspective as an organizer and as an activist, I will never try to compromise my own messaging. As OCAD, we will always be asking to stop all deportations, right? Knowing that the system is always going to try to compromise. And that job really is for those policymakers and for the elected officials to kind of go back and forth between them to determine that. But for me and for OCAD, right, we are the ones that are pushing them to even have those conversations. And it is important for us to not compromise with our own goals and desires about what a vision or what we can envision a world to be without ICE, without terrorization in our communities, with better resources for mental health, for education, and then also at the end of the day with a world without borders, right, where people are able to migrate freely in order to pursue happiness and a better life. But with that, let's move on to our next question that I see.
Okay.
And some of these I see that we might have an answer through our responses. As activists, should we be fighting for abolition of ICE or for policy change? I think that's very similar. I think for me, right, and that's just my opinion, that we should be fighting for the abolition of ICE, right? Just as right now we're saying defund the police based on the Black Lives Matter movement, we need to take the leadership of those directly impacted of the movements that we're fighting for.
That's right.
And right now what we need is to abolish ICE.
And I would also, number one, I would agree with that. And I think, if the book shows anything, it's that, the system as it is and as it has been has to go. And also things that might seem unrealistic or utopian or idealistic, we've seen in recent weeks around the struggle for Black Lives Matter and against police violence, that what we thought possible or impossible, might actually be entirely possible and real if enough pressure is applied, if enough people are behind it, if thousands and thousands of people are supporting these efforts. If the stars align between the activists pressuring from below and the politicians who might see it in their own self-interest from above, then change can happen in surprising ways. So I agree that the pressure should continue.
I'll answer this one very fast. It's directly to me. Where have you been seeing the most impactful wins of your campaigning through litigation strategies, issues, cultural campaigning? And I will respond to that with both, right? But the most important impactful thing that I think we have done as OCAD is to empower undocumented immigrants to be their best advocates, to be outspoken about what's happening, the treatment that they receive in detention centers through the immigration system, and for them to then empower other undocumented immigrants to want to fight and resist the system, right? Because imagine what a world would look like, or even just the immigration system conversation would look like, if all 12 million undocumented immigrants tomorrow would do an action that correlated all of us together, right? And what we could possibly do. And I think that that's the most important thing to remember, right? That as undocumented immigrants, we do have that power for transformation and for change, and that starts with us in order to empower and to change the minds of others that might not see or that might not understand our stories. And then, let me see.
I would just briefly interject to note that if people haven't seen it yet, there's a link in the chat to donate to OCAD. Wanted to bring that to your attention as we get to the last part of our conversation.
Thank you so much. I'll take this, or this another question. How was the Mexican government attitude towards deportees change over time?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a good question. And, sadly, I think a lot of times the Mexican government hasn't necessarily cared for the deportee community or for Mexicans who are facing deportation in the United States. And the consulates in the United States have provided essential services to Mexican migrants throughout the 20th century. They're really making a big difference for many. But if you talk to many Mexican migrants or people who have been deported. When I lived in Mexico for a few years, when I was doing my research and writing this book in the early stages, and I'd be at meetings with recently deported individuals who basically talked about feeling abandoned by the Mexican government. And if anyone's interested in this theme, there's a very good book by Ana Mignan, the historian Ana Mignan, called Undocumented Lives, which discusses how both the U.S. and Mexican governments have rejected or not embraced Mexican migrants. And I think that has a long history. I think currently the Mexican government has been very poor on questions of migration for both Central American refugees and asylum seekers and returning deportees. The history of deportation is bipartisan in the United States. Democrats and Republicans both have a long track record that's been bad. There's a potential that will change. I'm a little skeptical. I'm not holding my breath on that one. But this current administration has created the situation where people on the Democratic side, I think, see a common enemy in the president and the administration and might break from that. How Mexico reacts, if at all differently, is difficult to say. But we could be seeing a change moving forward. I think optimistically, I would like to think that we will. But if history is a guide, we should proceed with caution on that optimism as well.
Mm-hmm. And with that, Adam, perhaps we can do kind of our own questioning that we had planned for the end of this webinar or this conversation. And what can people do, right, to dismantle this machine that you go on and explaining how it functions throughout history and currently? What do you think that people could do on their own to kind of help us dismantle it?
I wish I had a perfect answer. But, I do think there are things that people can do. I'm certainly getting involved politically, and that could be at the local level, like looking in your immediate surrounding area. My guess is that there are people already doing this important work, organizations like OCAD in Chicago and other places around the country, seeing how you may be able to support them, participating, supporting them financially, also looking at candidates who are running for offices at all levels, local, state, federal. What are their stances and policies? And trying to push for the candidates that reflect your values and reflect the changes that you'd like to see. And I know that a lot of immigrant organizing groups are now getting involved and recommending or making recommendations about certain political races, which I think is really encouraging as well. There's a really broad vision. So there's all kinds of things that could happen at the local level that people could do. But then there's also, many other challenges along the way. And educating yourself, learning more about these issues is an important first step. But I think moving beyond education and empathy and actually taking action to support OCAD and other groups who are fighting on behalf of the immigrant community, that would be the place that I would start. What do you think, Antonio?
I think for me, and within the work that I've done with OCAD, and that I've been very fortunate to be part of, right, is that as an undocumented immigrant, I am no longer afraid. I am no longer watching what I say or do out of fear of what ICE is gonna do to me or deporting me, because I know that I'm connected to a community that has my back and that will support me through that process. And that I think that if you can go and show support to your undocumented neighbors, to your, that will be a great start, right? Because then that will empower them for them to find the courage to be unafraid and to resist this political machine, right? And whenever we get these little wins, right? When Wilmer Catalan got released, when Beto got released, when Genoveva got to stay, even though she needed to be deported within a couple of days, like when we do those wins, we are creating a movement, a momentum for others to resist, for them to not let the fear that's been implanted for us in centuries, right, through immigration and its policies and its fear campaigns, for people to not just sign a voluntary departure so that it's easy for them to be deportable, but to instead know their rights and to fight the system. And that's the way that I believe that we're gonna be able to dismantle this machine that, as I said, that machine was created not to serve a purpose of how we do immigration in the United States, but a system of who needs to be deported based on racist, based on white supremacy, and based on a system that literally benefits out of the exploitation of labor of undocumented immigrants, while also deciding that they also are disposable at the same time. So continue to advocate, continue to support those that are undocumented and leading the movement. And I believe that we can win, right? Because as Shakur says, we have nothing to lose but our chains. And I believe that it is the time for us to really try to win, that I believe that we can, because if we don't, we might have to unfortunately look at the moment in time that we are right now, as we look at other moments in history, like the Holocaust, with a lot of what would we do at that moment, and that we only get to ask that now. Let's not ask that in 20 years from now, or 10 years, or 50 years down the road. Let's ask that question right now to each other, so that we can actually do this, and do this in the most efficient way for all of us to be able to see the humanity in each other.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for leading the way, first and foremost. Both you individually and OCAD as an organization. And I think it's through that collective struggle that you're describing and through the mass support that change will happen. And I agree that this is a battle that may seem insurmountable, but it can be won through that collective action and pressure and sustained struggle. So thank you for the work that you all are doing as well. And thanks to everyone for joining us, and thanks to Women and Children First for hosting the discussion. And I hope everyone will, again, support OCAD, support Women and Children First, and look for ways that you can act today or tomorrow, and not 5, 10, 20 years from now.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.